And now our host, Stephen Lee Morris.
On July 8th, the Los Angeles theater community lost a fixture with the death of Neal Weaver. Neal was a playwright, a director, and a drama critic for decades in Los Angeles. He was born in 1935 in Mayfield, Kentucky. After attending Northwestern University, he went immediately to New York, where it took him a little time, but after actually serving in the U.S. Army, shortly after arriving in New York, he got employment with the Actors Studio as a stage manager for the playwrights unit of the Actors Studio in New York. As such, he was privy to all the various classes, and he got a theater education, a hands-on education, while actually being paid for it. And he has written extensively about that. He went on to form his own theater company in New York called Meat and Potatoes Company, and in 1987, he packed his bags and came to Los Angeles, where he worked as a theater critic for an alternative papers, a number of alternative papers. The first one was the Village View, which later came to be known as the LA View. A competing alternative weekly rolled into town and purchased both. If people remember those years, they purchased the LA Reader and the View. The View. Neal lost work, and it was around this time, shortly after I was installed as theater editor at the LA Weekly. I hired Neal as a theater critic, and we've been colleagues ever since. Neal can probably be best described as a theater enthusiast, but he could be quite exacting when he got annoyed with a production he was seeing, and he tried to attach a vision of dramaturgy and a vision of the theater in his support for it and in his reviews. Personally, as he was in his reviews, he was both generous, he loved the art form, and he really wanted to support it. And he could also be quite cranky. Had he lived to July the 21st, he would have been 86 years old. And I think a number of people were mystified that he lived that long, given he was a lifelong chain smoker. And by his own admission, he ate mostly greasy meats and dairy, and yet he did live to almost see his 86th birthday. And for this episode of Animal Farm, we've assembled people who knew him, a few people, colleagues and friends, who will comment on him, on their memories of him. We have Terry Price joining us. Terry was one of the founding actresses of Meat and Potatoes Company in New York. We have his colleagues at the LA Weekly and at Stage Raw, both Deborah Klugman and Martine Hernandez. Deborah continues to write for Stage Raw. Martine has moved to St. Paul, and he's joining us from St. Paul. And finally, we have theater critic Amy Nicholson. I say theater critic, she's actually a film critic now, but she was a theater critic when she was at the Weekly. And she had numerous interactions with Neal, particularly in the course of the LA Weekly Theater Awards and the nominations process.
Hello, my name is Terry Price, and I first met Neal Weaver in 1976 when he asked me to be a founding member of his theater company. Neal had been teaching theater at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. I always thought that was a great thing. And he decided to open his own theater company. We were a small showcase theater, off-Broadway theater. And Neal was the artistic director and the producer and the director and the set designer and no, he didn't do stage managing. He always had a stage manager. Very small operation. There were a core group of us who began the theater company, and then as the company began to garner attention, then a lot of other actors came through. We were a small group; we couldn't possibly do it all, and so public auditions began to occur, and over the 10-year period, hundreds of people, hundreds of young actors, young and old, across the boards at the Meat and Potatoes Theater Company, which later became the Meat and Potatoes Theater Company at the Alvina Krause Theater. Neal had studied with the amazing Alvina Krause at Northwestern University when he was young, and had worked at her summer theater all of his summers and was devoted to her. I actually got to meet her once shortly before her death when she came for the dedication of the theater. I'm off on a sidetrack there. Neal was a very, what is the word? He was a very dedicated director, dedicated to truth in the giving of performances, the staging of performances. Neal was just not someone who would take a Shakespeare and do it as some kind of odd concept in gangster clothes or something strange like that. He just really had no use for such productions. He also believed in honoring the author's words to the extent that he never cut anything. When we did Romeo and Juliet, we did every single scene, including the one that wraps up and tells you everything that's already happened. The only scene that was cut was the one with the musicians, and that was because he couldn't get musicians. Otherwise, it would have been included as well. As I said, a lot of young actors, old actors, went through that space. I think the most famous was a very young W.H. Macy. Mr. Macy performed in Neal's own play, War Games. Almost all of Neal's productions were classics, Shakespeare, Shaw, Ibsen, and Agatha Christie anytime he could get one in, because they really brought the audiences in. And he was faithful to the productions. We were in something that was like a small black box, but we didn't do it as a black box style production, if you'll excuse me for that. In 1987, the theater could no longer sustain itself, and Neal decided that he was going to come out to California. So he packed everything up and moved out, and, well, you all know better than I what his life has been like out there. I know that he loved his work as a theater critic. He loved theater. It was the very reason for him to exist, and I'm going to miss him a lot. I have seen him a lot over the last couple of years because I have family in California and I come out, but I hope he rests in peace. A lot of his former actors have commented about how much they enjoyed working with him and how grateful they were to him for his giving somebody a chance, taking a chance on them. He was really good about that, and I really will miss him.
Hi everybody, this is Deborah KLUGMAN, and I'm here to say something about our friend and colleague, Neal Weaver, who recently passed from us. I've known Neal for a very, very long time. I think we met back in the 1980s when we were both working for the LA View and both writing theater reviews and other reviews. And then we both worked at LA Weekly, and then in the most recent years at Stage Raw, as you know. And although I did not know Neal intimately, I did know him very well as a colleague. I worked with him as an editor in over the last few years at Stage Raw, and I know him to be a tremendously committed person, someone who had strong opinions and stood by his opinions, and was always so professional in his work. He was never late. And you knew that he really cared about what he was doing, and he cared about the theater that he was commenting on. He was a very honorable guy and a no BS guy. And that's my kind of guy. So anyway, this is just what I have to say about Neal, and I'm sorry he won't be with us any longer. But I'm glad for the years that I did know him.
Hello, my name is Martin Hernandez, and beginning in 1994, I worked as a theater critic for the LA Weekly for a good 20 some odd years. After that, I was working with the Stage Raw theater website as a theater critic, and also I was on the LA Drama Critics Circle. In all three of those entities, I was a colleague of Vernon Neal Weaver, who unfortunately passed away a week or so ago. Neal was the consummate Southern gentleman. He was filled with theater history and stories from productions back in New York, from Broadway to off-Broadway to off-Broadway, and any place in between, as well as stuff in LA and other places. So he was always having stories to tell about certain actors and actresses and producers, etc. When Neal had to move out of his apartment in the West Hollywood, he had a lot of memorabilia to get to have. He couldn't take with him. He had books, he had magazines, he had DVDs, VHS tapes, photographs, tons and tons of stuff. And I volunteered to take some of that stuff off his hands because he couldn't take it with him. At the time, I was living in Los Angeles. Currently, I'm in St. Paul. And my wife and I had a community library in front of our house in our driveway. We had a bookshelf, we had books in there, and we put stuff in there. So I said, Neal, we'll take the books, give us what you want, and we'll put them out there. So every few weeks, I would trek over to West Hollywood. Neal would have a shopping cart that he absconded from somewhere. I don't know. We will not say where that shopping cart came from or went to. It doesn't matter now, I guess. But we would pack. He'd have them boxed up, and we'd put them in the boxes, or we'd help him box stuff up. Take it down downstairs, load them up in my car, and we would put those books in our library. And they were very popular. People took them. And there were books on theater, there were magazines on theater, DVDs, as I said, VHS tapes, a whole bunch of stuff. I have some of the good ones. I kept some of the good ones. This is Ran, Touch of Evil, real collector's item, Iceman Cometh with Jason Robards from the 1960s, and Robert Redford was also in the cast as a young man. So I'm very proud to have these in hand, and I'd like to think that the books that Neal donated to us and donated to our community are in the hands of people now that maybe are thinking of life in the theater, or at the very least know a little bit more about theater and have been enlightened in some way about the theater, which is quite a fitting legacy for Neal. That he may be gone in body, but his spirit continues somehow in those books. That's what I'd like to think, that they're in the hands of people in our neighborhood or some other neighborhood, and now hopefully they will be passed on to other generations. That's my hope. And Neal, thank you very much for your friendship and knowing you, and being such a mensch. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Hi, I'm Amy Nicholson, and I was lucky enough to be a critic alongside Neal for 10 years. And, you know, Neal Weaver was a fixture in the theater world. And when I say fixture, I mean that quite literally, because Neal had a rare solidity. When I met him nearly 20 years ago, his whole way of being had a permanence, as though he'd already decided how he wanted to live his life, and he was just carrying out his plan. I mean, yes, he wanted to eat what he wanted and smoke what he wanted. I mean, has there ever been a man more impervious to the trend of avocado toast? But more importantly, though, Neal had decided to give his life to art. He wanted to see as many plays as possible, any kind of play, so long as there was the potential that it might be good. Neal was devoted to the chance of finding great art, and he took on the risks of a bad night at the theater for the hope that he could give himself over to something transcendent. And if not transcendent, at least above average. And Neal pulled it off. You know, he did it. He lived his very long life on his very own terms. And through it all, he maintained the best head of hair in the theater world. So, Neal, I salute you. Thank you for being you. Thank you for letting me know the you that you were. And thank you for letting all of us who knew you see what a truly independent life is like. We're fortunate to know you. Thank you, Neal.
Next week, we're joined by Lindsay Rodzinski. Lindsay starred in the Broadway production of Chicago in the role of Roxy. She was also played the same role on the national tour of that musical. Lindsay is currently studying law at the Southwestern School of Law, and she will be joining us from her home in Las Vegas.